The next agenda item is Council and Commission statements, the situation of migrants on the border between Greece and Turkey and the common response of the EU. Can I give the floor to Mrs. Brynjuc, the Minister, on behalf of Council, please?
Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner, honourable members.
Just a minute. Wir haben mit dem Mikrofon, können wir es bitte?
Can we try the microphone?
Sieht schlecht aus.
This is looking bad.
We have a microphone that you would have to hold in your hand, I'm afraid. Yeah, could you try again? There was a light. You need magic hands now. Not working. There's a mic if you would like to take that.
I would like to thank you for this very timely debate. Since the start of our presidency, this is the third time that we are discussing in the plenary the situation at our external borders. This shows the importance this Parliament gives to this issue, and we fully endorse it. Let us start with the situation on the Greek borders, which is indeed the most pressing one. Greece has been under considerable pressure since 27th of February, following the announcement of Turkish authorities on opening borders towards the EU. According to some reports, there were some 20,000 persons in wider border area of the Turkish side, trying to move towards Greek sea and the land borders. But due to a timely reaction, both on operational and political level, massive illegal border crossings did not take place. Despite certain incidents, we can say that the current situation is stable, both on land and sea borders. Last week, Home Affairs Ministers met for an extraordinary Council meeting to discuss the situation at the EU external borders with Turkey. In line with the strong statements of the presidents of the EU institutions the day before during their visits to the Greek-Turkish border, the ministers expressed strong solidarity with Greece, but also with other member states which might be similarly affected in other efforts to manage EU's external borders. The minister sent a clear message that while we acknowledge the increased migratory burden and risk that Turkey is facing on its territory and the substantial efforts it has made in hosting 3.7 million migrants and refugees, we strongly reject Turkey's use of migratory pressure for political purposes. The EU and its member states remain determined to effectively protect the EU's external borders, and illegal crossings will not be tolerated. In this regard, the EU and its member states will take all necessary measures in accordance with the EU and the international law. The current situation at the external borders is not acceptable. We expressed clearly our expectations that Turkey will continue with the full implementation of the 2016 joint statement. The statement procedures produces tangible results in both the EU and Turkey, and we are therefore in favour of the continuation of this cooperation and commitment. The EU wants to continue supporting refugee communities in Turkey, as it has been doing for the past years. Migrants should not be encouraged to endanger their lives by attempting illegal crossings by land or sea. The Council called upon the Turkish government and all actors and organisations on the ground to relay this message and counter the dissemination of false information. Linked to this is the thriving business of organised crime networks and opportunistic migrant smugglers, which we will continue to fight actively. These messages were again clearly stated by our foreign ministers following the Foreign Affairs Council on 6th of March, which took place in Zagreb. As you know, yesterday President Michel and von der Leyen met President Erdoğan. The leaders discussed bilateral relations, the implementation of the EU-Turkey statement, as well as the crisis in Syria. The President Michel said after the meeting that it had been a step in the right direction, as both Turkey and the EU need to work on the full implementation of the EU-Turkey statement on the migration in order to de-escalate the situation. Leaders decided to task High Representative Borrell and the Turkish Minister for Foreign Affairs to work over the next few days on clarifying the implementation of the deal between Turkey and the European Union. President Michel noted that the meeting had clarified a number of aspects relating to the implementation of the statement and in particular had provided an opportunity to show how the EU has implemented its financial commitments, including the pledge to mobilise a total of €6 billion to support refugees in Turkey. Coming back to the situation in Greece, our response has so far been the following. Last week, Frontex launched 2 calls for rapid intervention upon Greece's requests. One for the sea border and one for the land border. Deployments of additional staff under the Rapid Reaction Pool and technical assets under the Rapid Reaction Equipment Pool are taking place. Greece also activated the Union Civil Protection Mechanism for equipment that will help them provide arriving migrants with basic non-food items such as medical equipment, shelters, tents, blankets and other necessary supplies. Member States have been very responsive and quick in their reaction, and the Commission has been efficient in coordinating efforts. The Commission has offered an immediate assistance of €350 million to Greece, which is available to support border and migration management. The Commission also announced additional €350 million to further support the Greek authorities. European Asylum Support Office will issue the call for 160 experts to be deployed in Greece as soon as discussions with Greek authorities have been finalised. In addition, it is important to further strengthen regional and operational cooperation with our partners. The Commission has proposed to further develop a coordination mechanism with the Western Balkans countries. The pending status agreement between the Western Balkans partners and Frontex should be concluded as a matter of priority and quickly implemented. All these actions are a strong expression of our solidarity with Greece. They show we are firm and united in our commitment to protect the external borders. We will continue closely monitoring the situation at the EU external borders and ensure coordination between all those involved through the relevant channels. In a similar vein, the Presidency will continue the cooperation with the Western Balkan partners in addressing migratory challenges. The Justice and Home Affairs Council will meet on 13 March to follow up on the EU's response to the migratory situation. The Council and the Commission will continue to monitor the situation and coordinate the EU action. On the border between Bulgaria and Turkey, we were informed that the situation is stable. There is no increase in the number of illegal border crossings. However, the situation has to be closely monitored and we should increase our level of preparedness. Concerning the western and central Mediterranean routes, we have not observed deterioration in the overall migratory situation. But we remain vigilant on all routes. I will let the Commission elaborate on the specific points of this action plan presented last week for the comprehensive assistance that the EU provides to improve the situation at the Greek-Turkish borders. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Brynjac. Commissioner Johansson for the Commission.
Thank you, honourable members. We are faced with an urgent and serious situation at our external. I am worried about the situation, and I know that I share these concerns with you. It's absolutely necessary that we, the European Union, protect our external borders. But it's also absolutely necessary that we defend our fundamental rights and values, and including the right to asylum. It's our legal and moral duty to do both. And I can hear sometimes in the debate that there should be any contradiction between these two, and that's not true. It's absolutely possible to both defend our external borders. Of course, it's not Turkey who decides about the EU external borders, but it's also possible to combine with the right to asylum and to stand up for the fundamental human rights and for our values. I think that our most urgent concern is people, human beings. We need to support and protect people who are right now living under unacceptable conditions. In this situation, there are three things that we need to deliver on European level. First, as I mentioned, support for people. We have a lot of people who are already in a difficult situation, who have been brought to the border on false pretenses and are now in a very difficult situation. Even worse, I should say, is the situation for people on the islands, on the Greek islands. People in overcrowded hotspots, living under unacceptable conditions, and have been doing so for quite a long time. Vulnerable people, also families with children, unaccompanied minors, people with sickness and disabilities. But let me also mention the Icelanders themselves, Greek citizens that also are under high pressure living on the islands. Second, support for Greece, of course. Greece managed entry at our common EU border. And we are now facing politically motivated pressure at the European external border. It's necessary that we support Greece, and we are supporting Greece. And we are now taking urgent measures in all these areas. And third, of course, we must share responsibilities for supporting Syrian refugees also in Turkey. As you all know, last week, the presidents of the European Parliament, the European Council and the Council and the Commission visited the Greek-Turkish and Bulgarian-Turkish borders, stressing our unity, commitment and solidarity. Last week also, the Commission presented an action plan to measures to be taken by the Union and the Member States together to provide critical support to Greece. As a result, together with the Member States and our agencies, we agreed on a number of concrete steps. First, we agreed to support Greece and other countries to handle this situation, to protect our external borders and support people. Greece is obliged to protect their borders and the EU external borders, but they also have to do this with proportionate measures. With the launch of 2 rapid border intervention operations by the European Border and Coast Guard at the land and sea borders between Greece and Turkey, an additional 100 border guards will be deployed, as well as assets like helicopters and boats. Frontex stands ready to coordinate a new program for the quick return of irregular migrants from Greece to countries of origin. The European Asylum and Support Office is also ready to accelerate the deployment of experts to support in Greece. At the request of Greece, the civil protection mechanism has been activated. 16 member states so far pledged support to Greece. That, I think, is European solidarity in action, and in action quite quickly. Member states are assisting Greece by sending medical equipment, medical teams, shelters, tents, blankets, and a lot of other items that are needed. We also need to give financial support. The Commission will immediately make available €350 million, with a possibility to increase by another 350 million through an amending budget. And this will be used to increase the reception capacity and the living conditions for the migrants on the islands and on the mainland. It will be used for support the provision of services such as healthcare, food provision and transportation, to support the Greek Asylum Service, and to strengthen the ongoing voluntary return program. Tomorrow evening, I will go to Greece, and on Thursday, I will meet with the Greek minister and the authorities to discuss how we should implement this action plan. And of course, I will also ask the Greek government how they will act now to make sure that they can comply to the EU law and the right to asylum. and also to the principle of non-refoulement. Second, our relationship with Turkey. The EU-Turkey statement remains valid. We must continue our dialogue. We must de-escalate the rhetoric and decrease the tension. That involves finding a path forward with Turkey. The lines of communication with Turkey remain open and active. With Turkey, we share a joint responsibility for refugees and a joint commitment to the statement. That is why we are continuing a constructive engagement. As you all know, yesterday evening, President von der Leyen and President Michel had a constructive dialogue with President Erdoğan. The two presidents expressed very clearly to President Erdoğan their commitment to move forward with a perspective for migrants and stability in the region. And on our side, we are delivering on our commitments in the EU-Turkey statement. By having provided safe and legal pathways to Europe for over 26,500 Syrian refugees, by supporting schools, healthcare and basic services for Syrian refugees in Turkey. Honourable members, we must relieve the pressure that has been brought on the border. And the main way to do that is, of course, a dialogue together with Turkey. But we also must ensure the right to asylum is respected. To conclude this, let me say, the situation at the European external border towards Turkey is worrying. But I also must say, this is not 2015. We are much, much better prepared now to manage the situation because we know better what to expect. We have reinforced our agencies, we have strengthened, we have now Frontex, we have the European Asylum support offices, we have more willingness to cooperate between member states, and we have stronger structures between member states. That's why it's possible for the European Union to react so quickly in support to Greece and to the external borders of the European Union. But let me also say, even if we are much better prepared than 2015, we are not well prepared enough. And what we are lacking is a common European migration and asylum system. This is really a problem for us, and this has been my task since I took office. I have had constructive dialogues with all the 27 member states and a lot of dialogues here in the European Parliament on this topic to find a compromise forward for a common approach so that we together will be better prepared to face migration and asylum together in the European Union. And I must say that these dialogues have been constructive. You all know it's a difficult task, of course. But I am I'm more optimistic now than before I started the dialogues. And I'm preparing now the proposals, and you can expect them to be presented after Easter. Let me conclude with one aspect. I think I share it with many of you. It's the situation for children. And maybe especially those that are without their parents, unaccompanied children, minors, teenagers. 1/3 of all children arrive in Greece without parents or family. Around 5,500 children and teenagers in total, according to Europol. 10% are younger than 14 years old. They face violence, abuse and exploitation. Many of them just disappear from the asylum and reception centers, and we don't know where they are. I'm afraid that many of them fall in the hands of criminals. Sometimes the same criminals who traffic migrants also traffic people for sexual exploitation. Just imagine being a 15-year-old, fleeing, searching for a better life. Imagine how afraid you should be alone under these circumstances and under these risks of being victims for abuse and trafficking. My mission together with the Greek government, is to put in place a process to protect and care for these vulnerable children and teenagers. I want to find solutions that will help unaccompanied migrant minors, in particular on the Greek islands, with relocation to other member states, with medical aid, with housing, with safety, protecting them from being victims of trafficking. On Thursday, when I be in Greece together with President von der Leyen, this is the aim of our purpose, to continue or to develop new ways to protect these unaccompanied minors. I call on all member states to help these children and these youngsters and to welcome them. That's the spirit of solidarity we need that will see us through these difficult times. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kommissarin.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Johansson. Well, you see that we have some problems with the microphones. We're trying to improve this situation, but those of you who speak from the first row are going to have to use a cordless microphone, but hopefully those in the second row, at least if I've understood matters correctly, you will be able to speak from your seat. So can I give the floor to Mr. Weber? 3 minutes.
President, colleagues, we have a picture of what is happening on the Greek-Turkish border, and I'd like to thank the Commission and Council for painting a clear picture. President Erdoğan is exploiting people's suffering for his own political circumstances. Mr. Mitsotakis and the Greek government is implementing European law. 2015, there can be no repeat of 2015. The Greek government deserves our full support initially. Compare the situation to what happened in 2015. It is a different state of affairs at the border today because we have a government in Athens that is able to protect its borders. That was not the case with Tsipras in 2015. And so it's important to underscore that. Colleagues, I would like to thank the 3 presidents for travelling to Greece to support the Greek government. The European Union stands shoulder to shoulder with Greece. The EPP has every faith in the action of the officials located locally. They're looking to do their job, and all Greek officials will respect European law. So what do we need to do? Firstly, we need to start dialogue with Turkey. We need to de-escalate the situation at the Turkish-Greek border. Secondly, Greece needs our support, funding, Frontex, and we need to provide facilities such as tents. Thirdly, we're ready for a new agreement with Turkey, but payment should be made directly to aid organisations. The EPP is not willing to support the Turkish state budget. We're willing to help the refugees in Turkey, and bear in mind that Jordan and Lebanon needs such support. Fourthly, we need a solution for the people in Lesbos. Commissioner, you talked about the dire circumstances there, in particular for unaccompanied minors, and so we welcome the fact that finally we have a coalition of the willing at EU level to take in those in need. That is urgent. Fifth point. This is a clear signal that the EU needs to tackle the issues facing us when it comes to the MFF. The Council member states decided to cut the Frontex budget just a fortnight ago, and we need to be honest for once and for all. Do we want a common border and security system in place? Then we need to back that up with the right funding. Commissioner, we're waiting for your proposal after Easter, and we will offer you constructive support. We need to tackle the root cause of this problem, of course, Syria, and it is true that we need to do more than utter fine words. We need to be in a position to take action here, and we stand by Greece and Mr. Mitsotakis.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Weber.
Thank you so much, Mr. Weber. Mrs. Garcia Perez, please, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, President. Over the last few days, we have been able to see the very dangerous attitude of the President of Turkey, using vulnerable people in order to benefit himself and his politics. Despite this immoral conduct, we need to act responsibly. We need to grant support to Greece. Greece needs our support because Greece is the victim of the lack of responsibility of Council, since it has actually blocked the reform of Dublin. Mr. Weber, I do apologise, but I think that you made this reference to the change of government in Greece, because exactly the same difficulties which the government in Greece has at the moment to tackle this issue, exactly the same issue was the same with the previous government, and I really don't think you should be taking political advantage of this. Let us really shoulder our responsibility, and let us not use the misfortune of so many people by attacking a national government. We Social Democrats have seen that this debate has only been a debate on the protection of our borders, and we don't seem to be remembering the thousands of people in refugee camps or in no man's land who are suffering the consequences of this. The images that we've seen on the borders between Greece and Turkey are terrible. Of course, member states have the right to control their borders, but having said this, this type of control needs to be based on international law. I'm not sure whether Mrs. von der Leyen believes the same, because when she went to Greece and she had a meeting with the government, she said that the Greek government is the shield of Europe. A shield of what? Shields are used to protect ourselves against weapons, but we're talking about the life of people, of human beings, of vulnerable people. This is not shield. Protection is what we're talking about. We'd like to know a little more about the Commission, the unilateral decision taken by the Greek government to suspend all asylum requests over a period of 1 month. This means that the European Commission ignores the Geneva Convention. May I remind you, you are the guardian of the treaties. Article 78.3 clearly establishes that any measure taken along these lines requires decision taken by Commission and Council with the consultation of Parliament. So if we want to put an end to this drama, we need to move in all directions, because this humanitarian crisis will not come to an end if we don't put an end to the civil war in Syria. Council and Commission have a crucial responsibility. Mrs. Johansson, you've talked about this package today, and we've been waiting for this package because it's urgent, it's necessary. Remember that solidarity with Greece can't be incompatible with the respect of international law. So please, let's act on the basis of this responsibility. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Garcia Perez. And now I'd like to give the floor to Mrs. Inetfeldt for 2 minutes.
Chair, yes, it's working. And thanks to the Council and Madam Commissioner for your very heartening speech. Now, today we're facing the consequences of 4 years of inertia. The government leaders who have been sitting on their hands since 2015 and are now crying big crocodile tears because they've been cornered by Mr. Erdoğan, which cannot be a surprise. Europe has abandoned its citizens and Europe has betrayed its values. So let's try and use this crisis to do better. And I think that our adjusted work schedule should not be a reason for not doing our parliamentary job as a co-legislator and a budget authority. Now, firstly, we urgently need to relocate people from the islands with priority for unaccompanied minors and families with children. And I find the refusal of most member states, fortunately not all, to relocate people from the islands an absolute disgrace. And I would like to praise the local authorities who have been a lot more generous and welcoming, very often more wise than their own national governments. Yes, Europe also has to renegotiate with Mr. Erdoğan, but not a statement, which is basically no more than just a press release, but a proper international enforceable agreement under EU law and under scrutiny of this House. But more importantly, Europe needs its own asylum and migration policy, and we're very interested to see what the European Commission will propose. But let's be clear, we're not in the business of doing rubber stamping here. We will play our full role as a co-legislator and not sign on the dotted line. As to the 700 million euros which have been so generously promised by Commission and Council, we would like to know, again, as budget authority, what the money is for before we sign up for the 350 million. And finally, all allegations of violence by the authorities, and that includes Frontex, will have to be investigated by an independent authority. Finally, colleagues, let's use this crisis to end the paralysis and let's show the citizens that we can deliver. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Intveld.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Intveld. Our colleague Tardino.
Thank you, President. The situation of the hotspots in Greece, which we've already discussed in vain, has taken on a more tragic hue given the weakness of the Union faced with Erdogan's blackmail. Islands are at 6 times their usual capacity. There are children in refugee camps in inhuman conditions, open borders and millions of immigrants arriving from Turkey. It's a devastating picture. Greece is alone, as was Italy. What's Europe doing? It's reaching out to Erdogan as if the billions of euros already paid over hitherto weren't enough. And while we're cutting funding for agriculture, and while Mrs von der Leyen is weighing up whether to support Italy economically as it tackles the coronavirus emergency, rather than punishing Turkey, we're negotiating. That's the Europe we don't like. We've heard words like defending Europe's borders and Greece is our shield. Well done. We in the League have been saying for years that defending the border is a solution, just as we pointed to the danger of Turkey. Let's take action now. You've run out of time and you've exhausted public patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tardino. Now, Ms. Keller, for 1.5 minutes, please.
Dear colleagues, what we're witnessing here is a humanitarian catastrophe in many dimensions. We have one catastrophe of the humanitarian dimension at the Greek-Turkish border, but we also have one on the Greek islands, and we have one, not to forget about that, in northern Syria around Idlib. And it's the fate of those women, of men and children, that is the crisis, and that is what we need to care about. And it is shocking that Europe will only care about refugees when they pose a problem at our own borders. It is shocking that how Europe answers to people in need is with tear gas, with breaking the law and with suspending human rights. Is that who we really want to be? Those who are fleeing from a war, those who need protection, and those who are living in unbearable conditions on Greek islands or anywhere else, they need our solidarity. And the EU needs to support the member states on the borders, but it completely fails if this support is understood as just more policing, keeping people out. Rather, the EU should support Greece with applying international law by a rapid redistribution of the people trapped on the islands or at the border. The EU should focus on safely distributing the refugees. Hundreds of municipalities all across Europe have volunteered to accommodate refugees. They are real heroes, and those communities deserve our praise and they deserve our support. Europe cannot just turn a blind eye if it wants to be worth anything. It needs to help because we are all human beings and we are all equal. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Keller. Es folgt für 1 Minute Herr Kollege Frank.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fragos. President, over the last few days, we've seen a war of minds between Turkey and Greece. It's not about migrants, but about jihadis who Erdogan has sent to enter Greece illegally. because of EU policy, they are now able to get to the islands and Greece. Soros is funding all of this, and that's why we call on you to reject the European guidelines. We want to close the Greek borders. These pseudo-migrants should be sent to uninhabited islands, and NGOs should be kept away. Thank you very much. Mr. Fradkos, will you accept a question? Mr. Kokalis. Thank you. Mr. Frankos, you disagree with Mr. Weber when he says that the NGOs shouldn't be funded. But why do you think that they're being from Mr. Soros rather than from us?
This financing comes directly or indirectly and that's one of the things that happens in the Greek islands. The NGOs are amongst the causes which meant that the Greek islands find themselves in the situation we'd like that all NGOs to be closed.
Vielen Dank. Es folgt Frau Kollegin Ernst.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ernst, for 1 minute.
Meine Damen und Herren, ich möchte mich als
Members, first of all, I'd like to distance myself from the last speaker. It's an absolute disgrace on this house, what he said. I will just say something that a volunteer called this apocalypse. It comes from the Greek, but it means a revelation. And I think that Mr. Revelations is not the first revelation. Secure the borders and then deal with the people. Well, no, we won't go along with that. The revelation that I'm talking about means that we should show solidarity and settle people across Europe. There are 138 towns that would take migrants, but you are instead tolerating inhumanity and violence. You're happier to have pacts with dictators than accept people into the EU. We created Asylum after the Second World War, and it's being dismantled. And I say this to the Commission, you have to decide as well. Do you want to dismantle asylum law or not? Thank you very much, Ms. Ernst. The next speaker is Mr. Papadakis. However, I'm not going to allow blue cards where I've turned off a microphone, been forced to turn off the microphone, or where a speaker's gone over their time. Ms. Ernst, I've got it all noted down. Mr. Weber was at 3 minutes 26. Ms. Garcia Perez was at 2 minutes 30. That's 30 seconds too long. Ms. Interfeld was 2 minutes 19, and the others were in order. You were 1 minute 15%. So as a 15 seconds. As a percentage, you went over time the most, and therefore I'm not going to reward you with a blue card for that. Mr. Papadakis. Yes. The NATO and the EU. The control of Syria and the control of the migratory flows. What's at issue here is to try and bring areas out of Russia's sphere of control. People are being shoved around as a result of that struggle, for example, onto the Greek islands. Greece is using its islands as a prison for migrants in order to join in with these imperialistic plans. Frontex is controlling the borders, and the EU-Turkey agreement is part of this problem. We should bring these migrants to the EU if they can be allowed into the EU. Thank you, Mr. Papadakis. Mr. González Pons.
This is a provocation against the EU using human lives. Our first concern should always be for the lives and safety of those who are at the border. The migrants are not the culprits, they're the victims, and we also need to stand side by side with the government and the people of Greece, which are doing everything possible to prevent this crisis becoming worse. The Greek government is facing the difficult situation of protecting everybody's border by using the resources of one single member state. Greece requires our solidarity, our true support, direct support from the EU. What's happening here is not a Greek problem, it's a European issue. That's why there's the proposal to deploy 2,000 Coast Guards, a European unit, and an aid of 2,000 million euros to help the authorities of Greece and Bulgaria in managing this migration crisis. And above all, we need to stop improvising, stop taking a short-term approach. We need a common immigration policy for all of the EU that tackles the true problems of immigration, that will save lives, protect our borders, and in which all member states participate on an equal footing, by which I mean the same rights, the same duties and the same responsibilities vis-à-vis migrants who arrive in Europe. And lastly, this Parliament should demand that Turkey puts an immediate end to this escalation, whose only function is to put at risk thousands of lives. It's cruel and inhuman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. González Pons. Ms. Peary for 1 minute.
President, if there's one thing we know for sure, it is that after 9 years, the war in Syria is not over. Only the last weeks, we still saw 1 million people fleeing from Idlib. And now what did the EU do during the last 4 years? We stopped relocating people from Greece. We were not able to fulfill all the promises made to Ankara in 2016, of course partly due to the human rights situation in Turkey, but also because no EU leader was willing to put money on the table to continue the financing of 3.7 million Syrians living in that country. We failed to set up a real asylum system, and we looked away from the misery in Syria. Now, finally, last week, EU leaders acknowledged the urgency of this crisis. But von der Leyen spoke at the Greek border about Greece being the shield that protects Europe. Our shield from what? The misery of vulnerable people fleeing war? We don't need a shield for that. We just need to close our eyes, something we have been doing for way too long. It's time to act, strike a new agreement with Ankara, and help the real people on the Greek islands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Peary. Mr. Asmani.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yesterday, the EU and Turkey started evaluating the 2016 migration deal and talked about the way forward. Finally, Ms. Commissioner. Many doubts have been raised over this deal. But let's not forget, Turkey provided the shelter to millions of refugees and migrants for the last few years. Without this agreement, many would have come to the EU. However, that migrants are now being used to start dialogue, to pressure, is unacceptable. We need to safely return the people stuck at the Turkish-Greek border and help especially those in Idlib, and also helping de-escalate the situation over there. Moreover, we urgently need a comprehensive approach on migration. We need a full assessment at the external border of those likely allowed to stay and those who are not. We need also to have more sustainable partnerships with safe third countries. The EU presented solutions 2 months ago, and when will the Commission act? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Asmani. For 1 minute, Mr. Mariani.
Greece is once again the epicenter of these events affecting the European Union. It suffered the full effects of this irrational resolution to the financial crisis, and now Greece is being abandoned vis-à-vis her old Ottoman enemy. The EU is satisfied to invite Mr. Erdogan when he's being carrying out aggression against us. Expansive aggression, and this is served by a conquering form of Islamism at the very borders of our nations. The role of the European Union is to be side by side with the Greek people, which is mobilizing to defend its country. That's what the French delegation of our group, because we have two colleagues currently at the border between Greece and Turkey. We cannot accept this aggression on the part of Turkey. It's a cowardly one. It's converting the immigrants into Erdogan's unpaid mercenaries. You want to continue dialogue, President, but Turkey will only understand force.
Thank you, Mr. Mariani. Now for 1.5 minutes, Ms. Strick.
Micro.
Yeah. At the Greek-Turkish border, we are facing a humanitarian crisis as a result of 4 years that member states shifted their responsibility for refugees and failed to find a common solution. Men, women and children are now stuck in a no man's land in horrific circumstances, refused access from both sides, treated with violence and even run the risk of being shot at. Governments fail to act. They declare that our borders are under threat. But what about our refugees who are stuck at the border and on the Greek islands? Isn't that our common responsibility as well? If we are serious about a common European asylum policy, then let's act now. And that means that all member states should organise the relocation of asylum seekers, to start with the vulnerable ones. And their local communities show their way. At the same time, we need to ensure that the Greek government fulfils its obligations. The Commission has to clearly denounce the suspension of asylum requests as it is a violation of EU law. Commission, I urge you to use the financial and material support to enforce access to an asylum procedure, legal aid and all necessary services, and to bring an end to the violence at the border. It's our common and essential duty to guarantee that asylum seekers are not a victim of any political game. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Strick. Now, Mr. Brudzinski for 1 minute. Thank you very much. For the last few years, we have had a very strange situation given this cohabitation between NGOs and criminal groups. We've got the socialists and the Commission responsible for the situation in Greece and in Turkey now. Yes, the situation requires solidarity, real solidarity, which will actually meet the real needs of the people and which will guarantee the security of the citizens of the EU. That's why the Polish government, including Prime Minister Morawiecki, has expressed its solidarity and its readiness to act in solidarity. We want to make sure that borders are tight and we can reinforce border controls. That will happen by beefing up Frontex and helping our Greek friends if they request such help. The scale of solidarity is unprecedented and shows just how serious Polish is about the external borders. However, that's not being taken into account by those who had criticised Poland and its attitude to migration and who are unable, however, to show countries showing quite so much solidarity as Poland is at the moment. Thank you very much, Mr. Brudzinski. We have now for 1 minute Mr. Arvanitis.
Κύριε Βέμπερ, την ξέρουμε την αγάπη σας για την Ελλάδα.
Yes, Mr. Weber, we know that you love Greece, and we've seen your appeals. But today we're experiencing the hypocrisy policy. Erdogan has taken advantage of this to blackmail Europe. The member states are playing political games with the whole region, and the EU has not condemned Erdogan. Even in the declarations of its leaders, they define Turkey as a friend. Von der Leyen is willing to give millions to Greece for closed centres, but it's converting into a prison. So proceeding with the closed centres without even discussing fair distribution. There's no talk about a summit. There's no mention of Dublin or Geneva Convention or the right of asylum. Today, more than ever, we need to have the creation of a democratic and progressive front for Europe of peace and solidarity. We need to take the courage to do so.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arvanitis. Now we have Mr. Lagos for 1 minute. Thank you. It's been my honour and pleasure to be on the EU borders together with Greek citizens who are guarding the EU and Greek borders. We've heard fine words about the help being offered Greece. However, in the first 24 hours there was nothing being done, and we were on our own on that border. These migrants have been a problem for decades, and Greece is always left on its own and is basically forced to let everyone through. That's how we got to where we are today. Erdogan is now literally threatening us with unleashing these migrants on us, and he's being paid by the EU to do it. We now have to call Erdogan and his government to account. That's the only way to do things. We've heard that Frontex have to support the Greek border checks, but Frontex really needs to be active on the Turkish side of the border, not in Greece, because Turkey is the root cause of the problem. Thank you very much, Mr. Lagos. We now have Mr. Maimarakis for 1 minute.
In his comments, Mr. Weber gave a good description of the situation and what we should do today. I agree with him, because there is a crisis on the borders of Europe, and the responsibility is solely down to Turkey. So this is a violation of human rights. Therefore, today, the Greek government is defending everything it can, because everything's being done is with the agreement of the Greek government. But for the EU to demonstrate its commitments and show that faced with these leaders that try to defy them, that it is possible for the Union to show its strength. There's a question of migration. This is at the heart of European aid. Often we've shown that we understand the problems in Turkey and we want to help find a solution, but according to international law, which Erdogan is violating, and he is taking advantage of the situation. But you can't negotiate like that, and he's not a fair counterpart for a dialogue if he doesn't change his approach.
Thank you, Mr. Maimarakis. Will you accept a blue card question from Mr. Papadimoulis?
Papadimoulis.
Dear colleague, you're quite right to point out that the opposition is supporting Greeks' efforts to counter Erdogan's geopolitical blackmail. But I have to ask you, what is your assessment of the fact that the government isn't fairly redistributing migrants across the EU or demanding that resettlement. They're asking for money, but not for resettlement. Thank you very much, Mr. Papadimoulis. I have to ask for your understanding when it comes to the blue card question. It's 30 seconds, and I'm not going to distinguish between colleagues from my own group or from the Bureau. You please answer the colleague.
Yes, that's true. The crisis of 2015 is different from what we have today. Today, we have a totally different framework with inhuman behavior from Erdogan. We need to understand that the images we're seeing are his responsibility, because Greece needs to defend the principles and the borders of Europe. As a result, there is this agreement that we are asking for its implementation by Erdogan, but it's a dead letter.
Thank you, Mr. Maimarakis. The next speaker is Mr. Lopez Aguiar for 1 minute.
This drama is so tremendous, so complex. We shouldn't be simplistic. We shouldn't just point the finger. The main point is the victims, thousands of them, on these Greek islands in unspeakable conditions. We have to give up on the ritual of indignation and just demand that those responsible come up with responses immediately and in the medium term. Immediately. Greece is not a third country. Greece is us. Greece is the EU, same as Cyprus, Malta, Italy. Their problems are our problems, so that means solidarity. But that doesn't mean that we should accept the unacceptable xenophobia of Greek neo-Nazis, nor should we accept unilateral suspension of the right to asylum, nor the suspension of Article 88 involving the European Parliament. In the short term, we need humanitarian corridors, binding agreements for children, unaccompanied minors, and also vulnerable people, and of course mobilization of the Asylum Fund. But in the medium term, the Asylum and Refuge Fund, which we want to have there. The speaker's microphone cut off.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lopez Aguiar. I'm afraid that you no longer have the floor, and I'm not going to allow your blue card question. The next speaker is Mr. Otian for 1 minute. This is a very difficult situation, and of course we stand with Greece, but we mustn't allow ourselves to be blackmailed by Mr. Erdogan, or do what he actually wants, namely that we transfer the money directly to the Turkish government coffers from the EU-Turkey deal. Perhaps it would be better to invest directly in Syria, where the money is really required. We are a community of values in the EU, and we can show those values, that we can apply those values by investing in Syria. I think it's right that we beef up that we send up more Frontex staff to Greece, and we need to make sure that citizens' rights and the rule of law are respected on all of the EU borders. It's quite clear to me that the situation in the refugee camps is unacceptable for an EU member state, and things have to change as a matter of urgency. All of the member states need to participate to protect the most vulnerable, including children. Thank you, Mr. Oetjen. Mr. Kofod, please, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman. The EU system should be ashamed of itself. The external borders have never functioned, and they will never function, because there's no willingness for this in the European system. Turkey's Erdogan has basically taken control here, and several irresponsible politicians in this parliament pay for it with billions of euros of the taxpayers' money. The system has failed. Turkey is not a friend, but a foe. Mr. Erdogan is not a president, but a dictator and a scoundrel, and many of the migrants arriving in Europe are not really refugees. The only people who have lived up to their reputation is the EU showing off its own impotence and incompetence when it comes to solving the major problem of Islamic immigration from the Middle East and Northern Africa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kufford. Will you accept a blue card question from Mr. Lockegaard? You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I basically share the analysis by Mr. Kofod when it comes to President Erdogan, and I don't think many of us could defend what Mr. Erdogan does. But I have to ask, all this down-talking of the European system, what would you say the alternative is to our European system? What will the ID group propose as an alternative, if not some kind of European solution? Thank you, Mr. Løkkegaard, for the question. I think the response is clear. We need to close our external borders. We need an Australian model where you cannot be granted safety in Europe, but somewhere else. Many of the people at the border don't have the right for protection. It's not asylum that they seek. They don't have a real need for protection. They come here for financial reasons. They don't have the right to come here, so therefore we need to close that possibility.
Thank you, Mr. Kofod. The next speaker is Mr. Karim for 1 minute.
Je suis écœuré, Monsieur le Président.
I'm disgusted, Mr. President. Greece and the European Union are acting totally illegal. Article 2 of the treaty states that the Union is founded upon the respect for human dignity and human rights. Article 78 states that the European Union shall respect the principle of non-refoulement under the Geneva Convention. What's happening today? The right to asylum suspended, refoulement on the borders, use of weapons, inhuman treatment. All of this is absolutely against the law. And these are migrants' boats being sunk. That's the sinking of Europe. I'm also disgusted by those European leaders who wish to welcome isolated single minors when 3 months ago nobody responded to Greece's calls. Our leaders are a bunch of cowards who play into the hands of the extreme right. And what they're doing at the borders is paving the way, really, for the extreme right to reach power. We need to stick by our humanistic values. We need to say the truth. We need to shoulder our responsibilities instead of signing this check, this blank check to Erdogan. Enough already. We need to go back to our basic principles of solidarity and humanity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Karim. The next speaker is Mr. Zambatsky. Thank you very much, President, members of the House. Many of us here should be ashamed of ourselves, particularly those on my left. In the last few years, you've always ignored what Erdogan has been doing. You've been ignoring the fact that he's a dictator who, for his own political ends, is happy to turn a blind eye to human misfortune. Now you're asking to open the borders again. But I ask you, colleagues, which of you is going to support illegal immigration? How many of you have taken up an immigrant from Afghanistan or Eritrea into your own homes? If I'm wrong, raise your hand and put me right. But I know that you don't have and wouldn't take immigrants into your own homes. And so that makes you hypocrites, and you should be ashamed of yourselves. Thank you, Mr. Zambatsky. Next for 1 minute, Ms. Bjork.
Okay. Sorry. No. Oh, sorry. So it's not me. Sorry.
Herr Kollege Zambatsky, gestatten Sie eine Frage?
Mr. Zambatsky, will you accept a blue card question? Please go ahead.
Mr. President,
given that Europeans have supported wars against peoples in these countries where the refugees have come from, given that we militarily and economically have absolutely destroyed their communities and their lives, do you not think that we should take some responsibility for these refugees? And do you not think that all European states should play their part? And yes, I've had an Afghan refugee in my house for over a year and a half, and I've had an Iraqi Kurd in it.
Много екзотично, много интересно. Благодаря ви.
Well, it's a very interesting question. Thank you. My dear colleague, let me answer you and instruct you on international law. A refugee comes from a war zone. Turkey is a safe country, and there is no war on Turkish soil. Therefore, you don't have refugees coming from Turkey to Bulgaria or to Greece. Now, if you want to lie and tell me that they're all coming from Syria, I can tell you that's not the case. They're coming from Turkey. Thank you, Mr. Zambatsky. Now, I hesitated a moment ago, Mr. Zambatsky. You were nearly called up there on a rule of order, a point of order, but only because you called a whole group of people hypocrites and not an individual.
Tack så mycket. Kommissionen och rådet fortsätter att prata.
Thank you. The Commission and Council still talk about protecting Europe's borders, although they're aware that people are being repressed there in a brutal fashion. We have to take care of our coast, protect it. We have to sink vessels. What is this? This is back to front. It's obscene. What we should be talking, all of us here, about is how to protect human lives. These are people who are fleeing. How to protect the right to asylum. How to protect the rule of law. Our humanitarian values. How should we protect all of ourselves against the upsurge of fascism? Because these are phenomena affecting all of us. This is happening at the borders of Europe. We need to act now to put an end to this and stop having these dealings with the despot Erdoğan, who's increasingly repressive. We cannot accept that we all dance here according to what Orban requires. We should defend our values and those who are fleeing for their lives.
Thank you, Ms. Björk. Now, Ms. Metsola for 1 minute.
Thank you. The situation at the Greek-Turkish border is critical. My message is clear. We stand with Greece. We will not allow Turkey and President Erdoğan to try to blackmail Europe by using some of the most vulnerable people on the planet as pawns in a geopolitical power play. It is unacceptable and it is irresponsible. And I think we can be proud that Europe has stood together in what is a very trying and volatile time. But that said, Europe must and will fulfil its obligations. Long-standing overcrowding is being addressed, and as we've heard, thousands of unaccompanied minors will be relocated from hopefully as many participating member states as possible. Of course, we need to reform Dublin and ensure a new pact on migration and asylum, but we need to take those decisions without threats from across the border. At the same time, we need to do all we can to support the Greek authorities, and that means ensuring all the Frontex border guards needed and EASO personnel immediately, and providing any and all financial assistance. To conclude, migration challenges are a global phenomenon that need a global response, and Turkey and the EU must be part of that approach. It is time for cool heads, de-escalation and serious discussions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Metsola. Now, Mr. Bartola for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I return to this hall in a situation that is not what we would like. We're in a difficult situation. We need to continue to work, and we need to talk with those who are on the borders of Greece and Turkey, and those who for months have been stuck in the Greek islands. This attitude from our member states has caused all of this suffering. We've got children involved, and we end up with suicides because of this. We need immediate solidarity with those who are stuck there. We don't need to defend our borders. We need to establish a mechanism for emergency relocation. First and foremost, for unaccompanied minors, it's unthinkable to leave children in such conditions. We need to be solidarity. We need to express solidarity with Greece, yes, but we need to state very clearly, without ambiguity, that the Greek government must have full respect of human rights at its borders, because the images we've seen over the last few days shamed me as a human being first and a European second.
Thank you, Mr. Bartolo. Now for 1 minute, Ms. Pazara-Ortundua.
Micro? Sí, funciona, sí.
Thank you very much, President. This morning, I heard it said that we in Europe are picking up the tab for what's happening in Syria. I think that's a totally wrong analysis. We are an international power in a globalized world, and we're not a military power. What's characterized Europe historically, our contribution to the world has been humanitarianism, solidarity. At least that's the way things used to be. And what we are facing now is that there are many people who are fleeing from Idlib. These are true refugees. They're not imaginary refugees, and we're not supporting them. And those who set up international humanitarian law after the Second World War, those who created the Geneva Convention, went through far worse circumstances than we're going through. We are giving up on our hearts as Europeans. And the weakness is that we're playing into the hands of Turkey. Our weakness is when we don't have humanitarian corridors and we don't have a common asylum policy. That's our true weakness.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pagaza-Ortundua. Now for 1 minute, colleague Madison.
Thank you very much, President. First of all, the solutions that were offered in 2015-2016, we saw them. Angela Merkel calls everyone to open borders. It resulted in massive chaos, and that had to be resolved with quotas, with uniform solutions. And where did that lead us? It led to a crisis in Europe. My message is that any pressure, any quotas, any reallocations, that will be the end of the European Union. Secondly, I've been repeatedly to refugee camps in Greece, on Lesbos. To call all migrants refugees is a lie. That's a lie. Over 20% of those people in 2015-16 were not from Syria, not from areas where war was going on. And our countries do not have the obligation to solve the problems that have been intentionally caused by leftist forces all over Europe. For example, also in Germany. I come from Estonia, and in our country, 65% of people do not support the common asylum policy, so forget it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Madison. Would you accept a question from Ms. McGuinness?
Bitte.
Danke. Jack, Mr. Madison, I know you for some time on COSAC. I know what you're against, but I'm never certain what you're in favour of. So instead of telling us what you're against, could you tell me how you might resolve this problem? And what about the real humanitarian situation? Yes, of refugees and migrants. They're all people. Who do you put first? People or borders?
Thank you, Ms. McGuinness. I know you very well, and I know that you're a very nice person. And my solution is also, we have to protect refugees in their own home countries and neighbourhoods. I've been in Jordan, 2015. In Jordan, where about 80,000 refugees were stuck in the refugee camp, and they got any help from the EU. And they didn't want to come to the EU. They want to stay in a neighbourhood country and go back to home as soon as possible. That's the first solution. We have to help neighbourhood countries in the Middle East, like Jordan. And second thing, solution like Australia, like Mr. proposed, is functioning.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Madison.
Thank you very much, Mr. Madison.
Folgt für eine Minute, Herr Kollege.
Now for 1 minute, Mr. Urtasun.
Gracias, presidente. La decisión de
Thank you, President. The decision to convert our relations with Turkey into just a financial relationship is something that is what's enabling Erdoğan to blackmail us through thousands of refugees. One of the collateral damages involves human rights and the right to asylum. This is a black page in the history of the Union. The situation, the President has accepted flagrant infringement of European law. We are paying here for passivity vis-à-vis Syria and the lack of a common asylum policy. All we can do is appeal to member states to accept refugees. We're glad some of them have accepted unaccompanied minors, but it's not enough. Humanitarian corridors, resettlement and scrupulous respect for individuals arriving at our borders are the only solution today if we are to be free of Erdogan's blackmail and also if we are to fulfill our international commitments in terms of human rights. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Urtasun. Now for 1 minute, Mr. Yaki. Thank you very much, President. It's clear that we have to defend the EU borders against Turkish blackmail, but we mustn't forget where the problem comes from, the problem of illegal immigration. That is the irresponsible behaviour of European leaders who invited them and told them they would get whatever they wanted. Only 2 countries said anything different. Poland and Hungary said that was the wrong way to go and things would finish as they have today. So, who was right? Looking back, a few years ago, Mr. Orban said that you have to tighten the borders, create security and stop the illegal immigration flows. We've just had a summit of foreign ministers of the EU, and what was their receipt? What was their recipe for solving this? Tightening the borders and stopping the flow of illegal immigration. So I think it's time that we reflect on that.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Yaki.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yaki. Do you accept a blue card question from Mr. Kugloglu?
Dear friend, some of the thousands of the refugees are in the border of Greece, my country, are coming from Iraq after this devastating, catastrophic war where 1 million people and more died. Your country was among the alliance of willing under George Bush that invaded Iraq and destroyed the country. Why you are not taking any moral or political responsibility as a country for this disaster you have created?
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kuloglu. Mr. Yaki to answer, please. Thank you very much. Please don't pretend that everyone we're talking about has come from Iraq. You're just twisting the facts. We're not saying that we don't want to help. Poland is helping, investing an enormous amount of money in situ. But we have to look at this holistically and not in a piecemeal way as you're trying to do today. Of course, we have to respect individuals and try and help them, but we have to help effectively, and we think the best way to help is in situ.
Take only the Iraqis, don't take the others.
You have not the floor, colleague. You have not the floor. Es folgt Herr Kollege George.
Next, Mr. Giorgio for 1 minute.
Κυρία Επίτροπε, την πραγματική κατάσταση.
Madam Commissioner, the situation, the refugee situation has been well described by Seferis in his Nobel Prize literature. Is that so many bodies there on the beaches? This is how people arrive in the Mediterranean. They're just like sand. You gave the key to Erdogan to cause this. He plays the role of refugee protector, but he's doing anything but. Well, then what we need to do is take the refugees, instead of criticizing the Greek government, we need to say, well, what about your countries? They should be responding in solidarity with the Dublin Convention and ensure that the current agreement with Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. Georgiou. Now for 1 minute, Mr. Peters.
Micro.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Micro werkt.
Thank you, Chairman. The microphone's working. Yes, well, 10,000 migrants are trying to come into Greece, and it's understandable and right that Greece asks for European support to cope with the crisis. Fortunately, we have authorized this, and we need to express more solidarity with our countries on the outside borders more than ever. But in trying to protect the borders, that's not solving the problem. We must ensure that the emergency regulations that were started in 2016 and which were farmed out to Turkey to welcome 3.7 million migrants, we need to ensure that we have a European asylum and migration policy to counter this. Madam Commissioner, how long must we wait until we get a breakthrough with the other institutions on this? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. Next, for 1 minute, Mr. Androulakis. Erdogan is exploiting this tragedy and the suffering of thousands of refugees as a negotiating gambit. Mr. Soilo has made it very clear how we arrived at this hopeless situation. Now, in this emergency situation, we need to change things. However, we can only secure borders if we support Frontex properly. But it's not just a flow into Evros. We also have to remember that there are 40,000 refugees on the islands of the eastern Mediterranean. So let's not just think about Greece and the borders there. Ask yourself how we can help Greece to resettle these migrants in other EU countries. It's not just then the problem of the border countries to bear this burden. Thank you, Mr. Androulakis. Now, Mr. Tudoraki for 1 minute.
President, here we are, 5 years from the first signs of this crisis, confronted with the same challenges and risks and with the same lack of structural solutions. We've been talking for 5 years about this crisis, about solidarity, about our strategic relationship with countries of origin and transit, and about European policy for asylum and migration. However, there has been a shameful political blockage during these years. We now have an opportunity and a historic opportunity to find a solution. I hope that the pact will be signed as soon as possible. However, in the meantime, we need to take a number of immediate measures. We have to leave the blackmail logic of our discussions with Erdogan. We cannot allow Erdogan to control the Greek-Turkish border. And at the same time, we need to act in Greece with solidarity, helping also to understand why the procedures are still so difficult to abide by 5 years later.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tudoraki. Next, Mr. Vilimsky. Thank you very much, members of the House. First of all, I would like to thank the Greek security forces for dealing with this flood of illegal immigrants. Why do I say illegal? Well, because we know that of the 700,000 asylum applications made to the EU last year, that 2/3 were not in line with the definition of the refugee under the Geneva Convention. So that means that 2/3 are basically faking or lying about their situation to try and become refugees. So I would like to thank the Greek security services. That being said, I condemn what Mr. Erdoğan is doing. That's blackmail that we mustn't tolerate. We have to put an end to this. For Turkey's station as an accession country to the EU has to be ruled out, and we have to stop paying money to Turkey as well. We simply have to draw a line on this. Mr. Vilimsky, will you accept a question from Ms. Metsola? Ms. Metsola, please.
So, dear colleague, if I understood you correctly, you are admitting that a number of the persons who are currently in Greece benefit of refugee status. Would you therefore agree that there has to be an agreement for the redistribution of those people, including also to your country, or would you conveniently also try to pretend that those are not refugees?
Frau Kollegin, ich kann keine
I can't diagnose at distance who deserves refugee status or not. I just gave you the figures from 2019, and that was that 700,000 asylum requests were 2/3 of those were rejected. So that means 2/3 involved incorrect factual declarations by people trying to get into the EU. But those people know that even after their asylum request has been rejected, they can stay in the EU. Thank you very much, Mr. Vilimsky. I said clearly 30 seconds for the question, 30 seconds for the answer. I'm going to be very neutral. So I would just point out that the blue card is there to ask a question, and I'm therefore going to interrupt people who don't ask questions. But you also have to answer the question you're asked, colleagues, please. Mr. Rangel for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. I think that this serious crisis that we are suffering on the Greek-Turkish border should essentially be solved on the basis of 3 pillars. Firstly, a humanitarian pillar. We need to have a local response on the Greek islands and in the border area. We need to convert the camps into more permanent settlements, and this is going to require EU funds. The second axis, if you like, on which we have to operate is a more permanent one, the defence of Europe's borders. The Greek border is a European border. We have everything required to transfer at least 1,000 or 2,000 Frontex staff to support Greeks when it comes to defending Europe's borders. And thirdly, the third aspect is, of course, in the medium term, a pact on immigration. There might be a fourth front, which is the war in Syria, and our opposing Erdogan's attempt, and Putin's attempt as well, to compromise the stability of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rangel. Now for 1 minute, Ms. Sakaropoulou.
Madame la Commissaire, et voilà 5 ans au passé.
Commissioner, after 5 years, we're now facing a further humanitarian crisis in Greece. We knew that we had to come up with solutions, but unfortunately we waited until Mr. Erdoğan reminded us that we were doing nothing. Ms. Commissioner, we have no excuses anymore. We're out of excuses. I am calling you calling on Europe to act, to assume responsibilities, to go back to the negotiating table, and I'm asking the Commission to propose a new European agreement on asylum and refugees in the short term. There's no time left. The Greece of the economic crisis, the Greece of the immigration crisis has been waiting for years, but as you can see here, Atlas can no longer carry all of this burden on his shoulders. And I'll finish in Greek.
We need solidarity as a whole.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sakaropoulou. Now for 1 minute, Ms. Sovko.
Mikro.
Drage kolege, predsjedavajući.
Dear colleagues, Mr. Chair, I would like to salute the coordinator timely response of the European Union, headed by Mr. Plenković, in trying to protect the outer borders from an orchestrated entry into European Union through unregulated mass migrations coming from Turkey. I am deeply disappointed that Turkish authorities did not abide by the agreement, which ensured significant funds for them to house a huge number of refugees during the war in Syria. The Turkish encouragement of migrants to march towards the European Union.
Now we have German translation? Okay. For the first 20 seconds there was no translation. Please continue.
Okay.
So the Turkish encouragement of migrants to march towards the European Union was a bad means in trying to negotiate about a situation which could have been talked about without including human misery. And it is encouraging to see a joint agreement from all the European partners about the inadmissibility of this type of situations and conditions. The civil protection mechanism has also been used in the hotspots, and what we need to focus on is impacts of this if the situation continues. We need to enhance Western Balkan countries in order to make their borders safe. They are our partners.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sovko. Now for 1 minute, Ms. Vosenberg-Vrianidi.
Micro. Thank you, Mr. President. Εδώ και μια εβδομάδα η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση.
A week ago, Erdogan has been using refugees as a weapon, and the European leaders went on site and they asked my country to shield the borders. We've got Erdogan's war with fake news, which he's carrying out. We do have a way of meeting this challenge, but we have to review the pact with Turkey. We need to ensure that we have joint missions with Frontex on the border. We need to see a transfer of the refugees to centres throughout the territory, not just on the islands. We need to quickly do something about the refugees that were taken by Turkey to the Greek border. We need to ensure that this situation is dealt with in a serious way. It's more necessary than ever today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Vosenberg-Vrianidi. We now come to the Catch the Eye debate. I'm afraid, colleagues, that we have 40 requests for the floor, but we only actually have 5 minutes available for this debate. As such, and despite the fact that this is the last item of the day, that we will limit ourselves to 15 speakers, the first of whom will be Ms. Weiss.
Mange tak.
Thank you very much, Chair. The situation at the Greek-Turkish border and President Erdogan's attempt to pressure more money out of the EU without handling the humanitarian crisis shows that Frontex doesn't work as it should yet. It's not just a matter of 10,000 border guards. It's not just a matter of sending more money. Frontex functions in its structure, its tools, its organization and its cooperation systems. It doesn't function the way it should, even though it should at this time, but it doesn't work. And I'm sure the Commissioner also knows this. And therefore I'd like to ask you again, Commissioner, how will you prepare Frontex to become a good employer, an attractive employer that can attract the right people so that we can stop this trafficking in human beings?
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Weiss.
Thank you very much, Ms. Weiss. The Council is under time pressure, so I'm going to be very strict about the 1 minute speaking time. Next up, Ms. Arena.
Merci. On a entendu.
Thank you. We've heard that Greece is the shield of Europe. We should protect our borders. This is shameful. Depriving people in danger of safety is simply illegal. The Union is acting illegally. What a lie to try to convince our citizens that making a fortress of our border would be the solution. What a hypocrisy to give more money to Erdoğan, who's not the solution. He's the problem. We need to give priority to human rights, a voluntary coalition of states. Stop farming this out to third countries. Modify Dublin. Change the 2001 directive. There are solutions. It requires political determination. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Arena.
Thank you, Ms. Arena. Now, Mr. Guetta.
Monsieur le Président, chers collègues, sans humanité.
President, colleague. With or without humanity and with or without intelligence, whatever we say, we're talking about a drama here that is going to shrink into insignificance compared to the crisis that we will have when the compromise between Turkey and Russia founders on the reality on the ground. Then millions will move across the border into Turkey and the situation will be untenable. We should be preparing, colleagues, we, the European Union and the member states, because it's the member states that will have to do this, a no-fly zone over Idlib in order to protect the populations there and avoid a disaster and move towards a peace agreement.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Guetta. Es folgt Herr...
Yes, thank you, Mr. Guetta. Now, Mr. Le Breton.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. The President of Turkey, Erdoğan, has made a statement, a declaration of migratory war on the EU. Despite the 2016 agreement, he sent thousands of migrants towards our borders. We have, of course, to express our solidarity vis-à-vis Greece, but that is not enough. We also need to show that we are determined to resist Erdogan's aggression. But what has the Union done to date? Nothing worthy of the name, to my mind. We are getting ready to pay Erdogan the ransom that he's demanding. We haven't even managed to send any Turkish ambassadors back to Turkey. And, of course, even less do we dare to break off the accession negotiations with Turkey. The merit of this is that we're learning that only the states can defend their borders. Frontex is like a hostess for the migrants. The army is showing the way.
Thank you, Mr. Le Breton. Mrs. Nanam-Siepen.
Ja. Die Situation an der türkischen...
The situation on the Greek-Turkish border is a humanitarian disaster. However, what we mustn't forget and what we should stress is that the root cause is the war in Syria. It's now into its 9th year. We must not ignore that when we talk about maintaining law and order at our borders. We need humanitarian corridors for Idlib so that we can help people in their hour of need now. And we have to stop bombing this land into the ground. Also, the war crimes should be documented, and we have to support NGOs. The EU has to build up its possibilities for convicting criminals, war criminals, and we have to make sure that this fragile ceasefire is used so that we can help all of those involved and bring indirect and direct parties to the negotiating table. Thank you very much, Ms. Langen-Siepen. The next speaker is Ms. Tomasic.
She's nicht mehr da, dann...
She's no longer in the chamber. Then Ms. Demirel.
Kolleginnen und Kollegen,
President, colleagues, I was on the Greek-Turkish border last week and I saw wounded individuals, exhausted individuals chased across the border. I saw people who'd been uprooted and taken out of their home countries. I saw people who were fleeing wars fought with weapons made in Europe. I saw children crying and playing at the same time. What I saw there is a disgrace for the European Union. We on the left always warned against the migration pact with Erdogan. He's using refugees for his own dirty politics, but the EU is still clinging on to this dirty pact. What we're seeing here is not something that I will put my name to. We can't simply just watch and look on. Many citizens are now ready to take citizens into their homes and help these people. This is now a crisis that we have to react to. Ms. Demirel, I have now turned the microphone off. I told you I would be strict. You are no longer have the floor. You no longer have the floor. I will discipline you, Ms. Demirel. I call you to order, please. I call you to order. You no longer have the floor. And we haven't heard the end of what you said. The interpreters haven't been able to hear it, and it hasn't been broadcast. Next, Mr. Castaldo, please.
Grazie Presidente, in questi giorni la Turchia sta nuovamente.
Thank you, President. Turkey is lately carrying out aggressive activities vis-à-vis an EU member state. It's pushing refugees and asylum seekers desperately towards the Greek border. We have to consider what our fundamental goals are here, and we have to reconsider our EU and also NATO's relations with Turkey, because this pan-Ottoman policy is still a danger to our security and to our interests. This is a true threat. Furthermore, there are other forms of aggression that, such as the Saide case and the agreements with Libya, in a series of cases where Turkey is making decisions against the interests of the EU and NATO. We have to think about why we are incapable of reforming the Dublin Agreement and coming up with a migration policy. This is blackmail.
Thank you, Mr. Castaldo. Next, Ms. Monserrati. Ms. Monserrati is not in the chamber. Then we have Mr. Basescu, please.
Thank you very much, President. I would like to thank the Greek people, those who protect the border, and those who bear the tens of thousands of migrants who came to their houses and their dwellings on islands. But what is surprising is that we are expecting Erdoğan to solve the problem. The European Union needs to do what it needs to do, and that is to negotiate readmission agreements with the countries of origin. Negotiate with the transit countries' governments and dismantle the organized crime networks and to return those boats that contain irregular migrants. Otherwise, we'll be blackmailed by Erdogan for years on.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Basescu.
Thank you, Mr. Basescu. Now, Mr. Mavridis, please. Thank you very much, Mr. President. If we're talking about an EU reaction, as in the title of this debate, then I think we have the answer. Unaccompanied children and refugees should continue to be settled. But what we're seeing on Evros is an organised crime against humanity and a crime against the EU, perpetrated by a criminal who we are all familiar with, and a criminal who is blackmailing us. Instead of dealing him, we are passing the blame amongst ourselves. We heard from the Commission, we know this. The Turkish military vehicles have been paid for by EU citizens' money, and it broke through the Greek border into the EU. A vehicle paid for by the EU. I mean, what do you say to that? The criminal Erdogan is being rewarded for his invasion of the EU.
As next.
Thank you very much. Next, Mr. Rodriguez Ramos.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, President. We are all Greece. It's not enough to come here one morning and say that we support Greece in the use of force and in defending our borders. Greece has been left alone for a long time. Greece has been waiting for 5 years for a relocating and resettling policy, so that refugees don't have to be huddled together in inhumane conditions in camps, as is the case on Lesbos. Of course, we've abandoned Greece. Absolutely we have. And Greece is all of us. But that's why it's important that Greece's borders, which are the borders of all of us, should be defended using international law, human rights. International law is not abrogated here. It's still applicable, and we cannot accept children who have survived 9 years of a fratricidal war having to die on the borders of Europe.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rodriguez Ramos. Next, Mr. Dari.
Grazie Presidente. Marzo 2016 l'Unione Europea.
President, in 2016 the EU and Turkey signed a deal which provided for Turkey halting the migratory flows in exchange for €3.5 billion. Now Erdogan has broken the terms of that deal, and thousands of migrants have been sent into Greece. The Commission President spoke with Mr. Erdogan this week in Brussels, and he asked for more public money from the EU, but we shouldn't give in to this blackmail. We must now interrupt accession procedures for Turkey to the EU, and we should further beef up Frontex. Thank you very much, Mr. Dari. Now, Ms. Ribaini Hare.
Gracias, presidente. La situación.
Thank you, President. The situation on the Greco-Turkish border this week is an insult to the human rights of the immigrants, and is a matter of trampling human rights which of course should be defended in the European Union. This situation is the outcome of years of inactivity by the institutions and member states of Europe. This is the result of the pact of shame reached with third countries which are paid money so that they can cruelly and in an inhumane fashion do what Europe hasn't solved in a humane and humanitarian fashion. So this crisis is being used as a threat to Europe's way of life. That's how it's being presented. This approach just gives impetus to reactionary and neo-fascist views. This is just feeding the reaction by the hard right against immigrants and NGOs. If the Commission and Council want to come up with a common response to the current migratory context, I would ask them to stop being hypocritical.
Thank you very much, Ms. Riba-Iginer. Now, Ms. Spiraki.
Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ, κύριε Πρόεδρε. Η πατρίδα μου, η Ελλάδα.
President, my country, Greece, is subjected to an asymmetric threat. Turkey is using human shields and it's funneling migrants from the conflict zone of Syria towards Greece, and we have to deal with them first. This situation is going to escalate. We need solidarity in acts, practical solidarity. Ms. Johansson, since the 27th of January you have received a request, but it hasn't been passed on to the member states as far as I know. We need support for Frontex, and it's important now that Turkey actually be excluded where it's not applying the Turkey-EU agreement.
Frau Kollegin Vollat.
Lastly now in the Catch the Eye, Ms. Vollat.
Herr Präsident.
Thank you very much, President. The good news first. We don't have to decide between tightening up the borders using violence and force or leaving people unregistered to enter into Europe. We want consensus amongst the member states about the fact that we shouldn't have batons and tear gas being used to decide who gets refugee status and not, but rather legally trained civil servants as part of an asylum procedure. The EU has to finally step up and help Greece, not just protecting the border, but also providing for the people there, accelerating the asylum procedure, helping the particularly vulnerable, and to come up with humane solutions, and of course avoiding attempts to extort money out of us. If we can do that, then we will have learnt the lessons of 2015. Thank you very much, Ms. Fullert. That's the end of the Catch the Eye debate. Commissioner. Could we, Commissioner, switch the order of speakers and allow Council to speak first because they have time problems? Is that okay?
Please. No, we need the other micro, still.
Thank you, honourable members, ladies and gentlemen. Do you hear me? I think it's okay.
The interpreters hear you, so the micro is on.
Okay. Let me thank you for this debate. The input coming from this discussion is important in finding efficient and appropriate answers to current challenges. There is no doubt that the situation at the Greek-Turkish border is very serious from a humanitarian and political point of view. We must address it jointly and in a comprehensive and timely manner in accordance with the EU and international law. Let me assure you that the Croatian presidency will keep working toward this goal as it has done so far. Many EU member states, Croatia included, express readiness to accept unaccompanied children and minors living in camps on Greek islands. Those children need our special protection. Member States will discuss this pressing issue next week after the Commissioner returns from her visit to the Greek islands. Thank you very much for your attention.
Vielen Dank, Frau Ministerin.
Thank you very much, Minister Birnats. To close the debate now, Commissioner Johansson for the Commission.
Thank you, honourable members, for this debate. We are for sure in a difficult and worrying situation, and I'm sorry to say, but there are no simple solutions, but there are concrete and possible ways forward, and the EU and the member states had acted quite quickly in solidarity with Greece and in support of those people in need in Greece. And I'm quite proud that we have been able to do that. I will not repeat what I said in my introductory speech, because many of you have asked the same questions that I actually addressed there. But let me just say these things. We need secure external borders. They must be staffed well and managed well. Therefore, Frontex has an important role to play, and it's important that the standing course can come to reality. With member states supporting Greece, the European Union can stand strong because we stand together. But the reason that we can stand strong is because of our values. We must show that the EU holds fast to fundamental rights even in difficult times. The circumstances that the Greek border are under are serious and exceptional, but the right to asylum is a fundamental right and enshrined in the EU treaty and international law. I expect Greece to comply to fundamental rights and to the right to access to the asylum process. As already mentioned, I'm going to Greece to have discussions with the Greek government on Thursday. And the day after, we will meet in the Council for Justice and Home Affairs to discuss further initiatives to take together. And I was asked here about the money that we would like to address extra, if needed, to the action plan for Greece. And this is, of course, something that we need to discuss together with Parliament, but this is aimed, if necessary, to put even more money than in the first 350 million euros. Hopefully, we can have a more stable situation, but we have to be prepared. Because what we need is de-escalation, dialogue and concrete actions. I hear many of you that argue for a new deal on migration and asylum to be presented soon, arguing for the importance to get out of the blocked situation that we had for many years in Council on this issue, and agree on a sustainable common European migration and asylum policy with the right balance between solidarity and responsibility. And I fully agree on that. Since the von der Leyen Commission took office in the 1st of December, I have worked very, very hard for finding a fresh start for this new agreement that I hopefully will present after Easter. I have the dialogue with all the 27 member states. There have been a lot of traveling. That was before the coronavirus, so that was easier. And I have a lot of dialogues with Parliament. And I hope for a continuing good dialogue to find a solution that is sustainable for a common European approach, because this is really what we need. To finalize, I would like to say this. Many of you have stressed the importance of relocation of vulnerable, especially from the overcrowded camps on Greek islands. I do share this view. It's of fundamental importance. Member states have shown strong solidarity and support to Greece, that are now under pressure to protect their external borders. This is towards Turkey. And this is also EU external borders, and therefore very important. I now call on member states, on all member states, to show the same solidarity and support towards the vulnerable minors in refugee camps that need to be relocated and welcomed in other member states. Thank you for the debate.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kommissar.
Thank you very much, Commissioner.
Excuse me, you have not the floor. And thank you for your flexibility, Commissioner. Bei der Eröffnung der gestrigen Sitzung.
When the sitting was opened yesterday, the Agri Committee made a motion not to object to a legislative act. No objections were made in the 24 hours, and therefore, according to Article 111(1)(6), that recommendation is approved, and it will be published with the other adopted texts. colleagues, today an announcement was made that the April sitting will not be from the 30th of March to the 2nd of April. The next sitting will take place as of the 1st of April in Brussels and end on the morning of, and will meet as well on the morning of the 2nd of April. The revised calendar will be available on the European Parliament's home page. I wish you all a safe and healthy trip home, and the sitting is adjourned.